everyone, and thank you for joining today's GUSMR webinar on reducing diacetyl. My name is Muile, and I am the product manager for GUSMR that handles the IFF brewing enzymes. Let me go ahead and introduce our presenters today. We have with us Andrew Fradiani, IFF Senior Application Specialist, and Kurt Dresner, Urban Chestnut's Quality and Process Manager. Andrew is no stranger to the brewing industry and has worked as the brewmaster at Pabst Brewing and GG Ewing. He was also the senior technical sales rep for BASF, as well as GUSMR Enterprises. Andrew is a member of the MBAA, the ASBC, and the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. Kurt began his brewing adventure at the St. Louis Brewery before joining Urban Chestnut as their quality assurance manager in 2013. He is currently the quality and process manager at Urban Chestnut. Kurt is a member of the Brewers Association, the ASBC, and the MBAA. All right, let's get this started. I'll pass it on to Andrew.
Hi, hello, and thank you to everybody for joining today, and thank you to GUSMR Enterprises for arranging this. I'm Andrew Fratiani. I work with IFF, otherwise known as International Flavors and Fragrances. I will talk to you about diacetyl, so how it's formed, how it's eliminated, and how we can manage it. And then Kurt will talk about a case study of work done at his brewery and the value that using an ALDC brought to his company. So first, we'll talk about what is diacetyl and why is it so important. It is a VDK, so how is it formed? And how do we reduce or prevent diacetyl formation? So there are some traditional methods as well as some newer method, which involves the application of enzymes. Dry hopping is becoming quite popular now, and diacetyl is part of that, or can be, depending upon the situation. And then after that, Kurt will go over his case study and present to you some very interesting information and give you some ideas about the values to his brewery, and probably will be the same for yours. So one, what is diacetyl and why is it so important? So diacetyl is a vicinal diketone, and it's commonly referred to as a VDK. And so what exactly does that mean? It's a little bit of chemistry here and organic chemistry. So in diacetyl, the primary feature is a ketone. And that is characterized, if you look down here, as carbon with a double bond to oxygen. And that also leaves two possible bonds here with other elements, hydrogen, oxygen, or other compounds. So the key feature here for a ketone is carbon, double bond, oxygen. Now, VDKs have two of these functional groups, and they're in close proximity to one another. So if you look here on the right, hopefully this is not interfering. You have oxygen here with a double bond joined to carbon, and another oxygen with a double bond joined to carbon. So it's two ketones, a diketone, and they're close to one another or in the vicinity. So this is where we get vicinal diketones. So they're in close proximity to one another. Normally, when we're talking about VDK, it's primarily diacetyl, which is 2,3-butane dione, but you could also have 2,3-pentane dione. And the way I keep them separated, or don't get confused about it, is I just go down the alphabet, A, B, C, D. So for me, in my mind, A, B, C, and D are all close to one another. So diacetyl is butane dione, and P is all the way down at the end of the alphabet. So P for pentane dione. You probably have a better method, but that's what works for me. Why is this so important? Well, VDK or diacetyl is part of yeast metabolism. It's a normal part of metabolism, but it can be a flavor defect. But diacetyl can also be produced from bacterial contamination. And the main effect on beer is the organoleptic or sensory effect. So that's what makes it important for us. Why is that? So diacetyl is normally one of the ways we monitor the progress of conditioning or maturation in brewing. So we're waiting for the level of diacetyl to come down to a pre-specified level in order to complete fermentation and maturation. So reduction of VDK is an important indicator of the progress of beer maturation. Now, generally, diacetyl is considered a flavor defect or a fault, especially in lager. And since lagers are the most widely produced style of beer globally, it's considered a key defect, but not always. Some lagers, in particular Czech lagers or pilsners, may have a low level of diacetyl, and that's considered acceptable. And some ales also, and more frequently in ales, a low level of diacetyl will be considered part of the flavor profile. But in general, for almost everything else, diacetyl in the finished product is a defect. So, sensory defect. The other reason for the focus on diacetyl is that it can be an indication of bacterial contamination in your beer, and specifically from Pediococcus or Lactobacillus. And so in the past, this was much more prevalent. In the past, when we didn't know that much about microbiology of beer, we didn't know so much about the importance of proper cleaning and GMPs. Diacetyl, due to bacteria, is much more prevalent, and it could, in the past, it could have put your brewery out of business. So I think that always remains in the background for any brewer today. You don't want contamination in your brewery, especially from Pediococcus or Lactobacillus. And so the sensory threshold for VDK in beer and a lager, generally 0.1 milligrams per liter or 100 ppb. It might be a little bit higher at 0.15 milligrams per liter or 150 ppb. But that's generally the flavor threshold or sensory threshold for diacetyl in beer. Diacetyl, 2,3-butane-dione, I'm sure everybody knows it's popcorn, buttery, or butterscotch aroma, and 2,3-pentane-dione has more of a honey-like flavor. So how is it formed? So diacetyl is formed in a few different steps. It begins as the precursor, if you're looking all the way here on the left, as alpha acetolactate. Now, this is a precursor to the formation of the amino acid valine. So if yeast needs valine, it's going to synthesize that within the cell. But as you can imagine, during fermentation, we have, especially during exponential growth, so a very active, vigorous fermentation, there are many different pathways that are functioning inside the yeast cell. And a lot of these biochemical pathways produce the building blocks for some other pathway. And all this needs to be carefully orchestrated. And of course, during fermentation, it's difficult to do that. So you might get an accumulation of alpha acetolactate because it can't be used immediately to produce valine. It also can be used to produce the amino acid isoleucine. So if this precursor cannot be utilized, the yeast cell cannot allow it just to simply accumulate within the cell. So it has to be excreted. If it accumulates, it can become toxic, or it may slow down other functions due to some kind of feedback. So the alpha acetolactate is excreted by the yeast into the beer. And this is also where another confusing idea or terminology comes into play if you're looking at diacetyl formation. We talk about a spontaneous oxidative decarboxylation when we talk about the formation of diacetyl. And to me, this was always a very confusing term. I had no idea what it meant. But if you break down these words and take a look at them, and then it becomes much clearer. So first of all, it's a spontaneous reaction. That means really this is a chemical reaction that takes place once this alpha acetolactate is excreted into the beer. So we don't need any catalyst. We don't need enzymes or anything else to start the reaction. It's a spontaneous reaction. And it's a chemical reaction. So that means with a higher temperature, as it takes place in any chemical reaction, that reaction rate increases. So a higher temperature increases the reaction rate. So it increases the change of alpha-acetolactate into diacetyl. So spontaneous reaction. Oxidative means it's an oxidation reaction. And if you remember from the term oil rig, oxidation is loss. So as in an oxidative reaction, the acetolactate is losing electrons. It's becoming oxidized and giving up electrons. So we have an oxidative reaction and a decarboxylation. And you can see right here that CO2 is also given up by the alpha acetolactate. So this is how it turns into diacetyl once it's excreted into the beer. After that, it can be reabsorbed by the yeast. But as you just noticed, it took me a long time to explain spontaneous oxidative decarboxylation. And that, in fact, is the rate limiting step for removing or reducing diacetyl. Once diacetyl is formed, the yeast will quickly reabsorb it and break it down to acetone or 2,3-butanediol. But that change from alpha-acetolactate to diacetyl is the rate limiting step. This is the slowest part of this whole chain of steps to take the precursor and turn it into acetone or 2,3-butanediol. Both of these have very high flavor thresholds. And in fact, I bet if I see a show of hands, and I can't see that right now from my screen, if I ask you who has ever smelled acetone in beer, I think nobody would raise their hand. And I don't think anybody really knows what it smells like. So if you're interested, it smells like hot fat. What does that smell like? I think next time you have a frying pan and there's some oil or grease in there, heat it up just prior to the smoking point or burning point, you'll get that hot fat aroma, and that's acetone. Aside from some certain beers, I don't think I've ever smelled it in beer because it has such a high flavor threshold. So once diacetyl is converted to acetone or 2,3-butanediol, we're not concerned with it anymore. Why does the yeast do that? The yeast does that because it needs NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. That's a cofactor that's needed all the way up here on the left in the glycolytic pathway. And that is what allows yeast to gain energy from glucose. So remember, glycolysis produces 2 ATP. Pyruvate is the end point for the glycolytic pathway. So we're taking sugar, we're taking the glucose that we produced in brewing and in the wort, and we're converting it to pyruvate. Pyruvate, as you know, can be turned into acetaldehyde and ethanol. It can also be turned into alpha-acetolactate. So this is an important raw material or a building block within yeast. But the key here is NAD. NAD is vital for yeast. If it doesn't have NAD, it can't get any energy. If it can't get any energy, everything stops within yeast. Metabolism, all functions stop. So NAD is vital. And that's why it's reabsorbing the diacetyl and changing it to acetone. That allows yeast to regenerate NAD. So all of it's related. So we'll look at some traditional methods of reducing diacetyl versus enzymatic. As I just explained here, this is a chemical reaction when the yeast excretes alpha-acetolactate and it becomes diacetyl. So we increase that reaction rate with an increase in temperature, and particular to this specific chemical reaction, a reduced pH. So if you look at that closely, it sounds very much like a diacetyl rest at the end of fermentation. In fact, that speeds up this conversion of alpha-acetolactate to diacetyl. We're going to allow the temperature of the fermenter to increase at the end of fermentation. The pH has already come down. We're at about pH 5.0 or 5.2 at the end of the boil, and during fermentation, that pH comes down to somewhere around 3.8 or 4.2. Once that diacetyl is formed, it's reabsorbed by the yeast, changed into acetone, and that is excreted again back into the beer. Some other methods are just lagering or storage. So a long storage period after fermentation. The fermentation is complete. The beer is transferred to a storage tank in a cold cellar, and then slowly that yeast will reabsorb the alpha-acetolactate. And it's a cold temperature. So already we're slowing down this reaction rate from acetolactate to diacetyl. You might also have, at end of fermentation, your yeast has already flocculated, so you have a limited amount of yeast in the beer. And the yeast might be stressed also. It's depleted the nutrients. There could be high CO2 levels in the beer, so CO2 stresses yeast, and there could be high ethanol levels. So even though you're counting on the yeast to reabsorb that diacetyl and break it down, you might not have sufficient amounts of yeast in suspension. And if they are, they might not be viable or maybe not vital. So vital being healthy and vigorous and able to perform from a metabolic standpoint. The other traditional method would be a krausen. So your beer is end fermented, transferred to a conditioning tank, and then you'll add about 10% by volume of new freshly fermenting wort. So you're taking yeast that's in a very active fermentation phase, and you're introducing it to the fermented beer to help reabsorb this diacetyl. But again, that temperature is lower. It needs to have sufficient amounts of yeast in suspension, and that needs to be viable yeast. And either with krausen or traditional lagering, you're talking about 4 or 6 weeks of storage time, or maybe longer. So your beer is ready. It's end fermented. You have the right level of fermentability. You have the right level of alcohol in the beer. And now you're simply waiting for that VDK level, that diacetyl level to come down. And you're tying up your tank. It's full of beer that's ready to go, except for VDK, but you can't move it forward to the next step, whether that's centrifuge or filtration or packaging. So if we introduce an enzyme here, an ALDC, which is acetolactate decarboxylase, and our particular brand from IFF is alphalase advanced 4000, this enzyme can take the alpha-acetolactate and turn it directly into acetone. So once that precursor is excreted by the yeast, the enzyme can turn it directly into the end product. And you avoid that lengthy process where you're waiting for the acetolactate to turn into diacetyl to get reabsorbed by the yeast and excreted again. And so if you go to package too early and you still have this acetolactate precursor in there, it can turn into diacetyl in the package. So in the bottle or in the can when it's out in the market. And at that point, you have nothing you can do to eliminate the diacetyl. So if you're adding the enzyme, it's added to the cold wort prior to yeast addition, and it will take that precursor and turn it directly into the acetone, which has a very high flavor threshold. And we have some customers in other regions who, before using the ALDC, we're waiting 12 and 14 days for diacetyl levels to come down to the specification. So again, the beer was in spec from a fermentability standpoint, but they were sitting another 12 days just to wait for diacetyl to come down. Now, obviously, there's some other things that can be looked at there, but once they started adding ALDC, they were only waiting 2 or 3 days to reach their VDK spec. So they were saving about a week or more of residence time in the tank simply by the addition of ALDC. Dosing guidelines, if you're in an all malt wort 12 Plato, it's generally going to be 0.5 grams per hectoliter, maybe up to 0.7. If you're higher gravity, 16 Plato or higher for starting gravity, or some type of adjunct, you might need more than that. You might need up to 1 gram per hectoliter. It's all recipe dependent and dependent upon your process and tank geometry and so on. But generally, we're looking at 0.5 to 1 gram per hectoliter as a dose rate for alphalase advanced 4000. Dry hopping. So dry hopping has become very popular here in the past few years, and probably will continue to grow or be popular because I think brewers and consumers enjoy it quite a bit. specifically, if we're talking about diacetyl and dry hopping, yes, it does happen. And you get diacetyl formation with dry hopping because you're restarting fermentation. And what's happening is that at the end of your fermentation in beer, there are some dextrins that are remaining. These are the non-fermentable sugars or carbohydrates that have been left in the beer due to the mashing procedures in the brew house. But when you add hops to them, there are enzymes in the hops that can break down those dextrins, and they're not broken down by enzymes in the malt. So what you're doing is you're producing some more fermentable sugar when you're adding your dry hops. You're probably introducing oxygen into the beer at this point as well. So you've added sugar and you have oxygen, and you still have yeast in the beer when you add your dry hops. So you're starting fermentation again. And the same thing happens. The yeast is growing. It needs an amino acid, it needs valine, and it's going to call for that precursor. And that again leaks out into the beer. That's your diacetyl formation from hop creep. The other things you'll get, and you're probably aware of this with hop creep, potentially you get an increase in fermentability or RDF. So your AE, parent extract, will go down. You can look at a potential increase in alcohol in package and CO2 as well. And so what we have found here, and it's really the craft brewers who are out ahead and doing the research and the practical application, they have found that they need to add ALDC again when they're dry hopping. The dose rate here is lower. It's about half of what you would add if you're adding to the start of fermentation. So it's a lower dose rate of ALDC if you're doing dry hopping. And without ALDC and dry hopping, you run into that same problem again. You're depending upon the yeast to be in suspension and healthy enough to absorb diacetyl once it's formed, and then reduce that diacetyl to acetone. And that's it for me. I think we will hand it over to Kurt right now, and he's going to walk us through his case study and some very interesting numbers. So Kurt, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Just want to start off by thanking IFF and Gwismer and everybody involved in this for being able to kind of share this. We do a lot of these sorts of things on our system here. We invest pretty heavily on the automation and control side. We want to produce, obviously, world-class lagers. And so we generally try to use every tool in the toolbox to make things work. And this case study kind of came about very organically in that we were already maximizing all these sort of traditional methods. And this came out of, I think anybody can relate that has a small brewery, a growing brewery, especially in the mid 20 teens where things were kind of blowing up. And we were dealing with basically doubling in size every year. And when things finally got a chance to kind of plateau and you could catch your breath, and it was an opportunity to really look at processes and see where things could be improved. We knew that we were doing a lot of things right, but we also, we had bought a new brew house, started a whole new production facility. We had, bought the initial batch of unit tanks, fermentation tanks, and we had actually then bought 3 more to supplement to try to keep up with our volume. And we were kind of hitting that point where it was becoming apparent from outside pressures that we were due to get another 3 tanks, and especially during that time, the lead time on getting some of these tanks was quite long, and we were kind of in a pickle as far as what we were going to do because we didn't want to squash production due to lack of tank space. And so we were exploring quite a few things. So I'll kind of show you where this came from. So I have a little bit more time to explain this than I did when we presented this at the Brewing Summit. And so, Andrew, if you could advance to the next slide, I will show you the initial case study.
There we go.
There we go. So we'll break this down a little bit. There's a lot of data on this sheet. What I can tell you right off the bat, just to be clear, is this is a snapshot of a year's production, all the batches of one particular beer that we produce, one particular lager. And we make a lot of it. And this is basically, we were already doing this. This is before we really were any kind of contact with IFF about using an enzyme. we were trying to see what we could do using those traditional methods that Andrew spoke of earlier to help with our diacetyl reduction. And things were pretty tight. When he mentioned earlier that some of the breweries he's talked to were sitting for 10 or 12 days of basically diacetyl rest, we weren't quite that long because we were already employing some fairly advanced techniques to minimize that time in the tank anyway. So when I speak to that, we were more around the 5 to 7 day range rather than the 10 to 12 day. So to explain this chart a little bit, the blue dots are the actual level of tested VDK utilizing the kind of traditional beer 25B, which is a distillation method in color development. And it has it's a nice, quick and dirty screen that you can do that gives you consistent and very usable data. And what we had at the beginning was, after we were just kind of optimizing, we looked at the flavor threshold of being about 100 ppb, and we decided that our original spec when we started the brewery, we would keep it 70. That seemed like a reasonable specification of diacetyl, then we could advance to the next step. And so that's what you kind of see with those blue dots. Underneath, the orange dots on the axis, those indicate the day of fermentation that data point was taken from. So that's your kind of final DVK level. The gray dots is when the beer reached terminal gravity. That's when attenuation ceased. And in this case, this is a non-dry hopped beer, so it makes those 3 data points the most important when talking about VDK reduction. So this is without any use of any enzyme. And what I want to be clear about this chart is I put those trend lines on there for a reason, and that anybody who operates, especially a craft brewery, knows that you can have kind of all the control things in place that you want, and then everything goes to hell. So you'll see some variability there, but overall, inside of the chaos that can be production in craft brewing, you'll see this downward trend. And so this is not something that was done in a lab. This is real data taken from real production. And you see that downward trend of our overall diacetyl level. And this was basically us optimizing all of those non-traditional methods, whether it be a very exacting temperature control and free rise, to optimizing cell count, pitch rates, you name it, everything you could possibly do to kind of expedite or expedite, or however you want to say that, the process of reducing diacetyl, we were doing. And that's why some of the data is kind of all over the place. You can see it's kind of changing some things, but the overall recipe, the overall parameters, these are exactly the same from batch to batch. You've just got, the kind of generalized variability in the background of beer being a living thing. The other thing I want you to notice, and it's a little harder to see, is down between the day of fermentation, or the day of terminal gravity, and the day that it passes diacetyl, that orange dot. You see the trend lines there, and you see them getting tighter and tighter and tighter. This is kind of how we monitored it. That basically that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to get our beer to pass diacetyl within 24 to 48 hours of hitting terminal gravity. That was our goal, and we were getting there. As you can see by the end, they're almost passing on the same day as terminal. So we were doing a pretty good job, at least we thought, as far as managing our diacetyl reduction and getting tanks turned over. And so that kind of, as best I can, kind of explains this sheet. And I think it's really important to understand that our spec was at 70, and all of this was based off of 70 ppb. After having some conversations with the folks at Gusmer, Font, IFF, all sorts of things, we decided to trial the enzyme at our smaller brewery just to see, because like I said, we knew we had pretty much exhausted all the traditional methods. So if you could advance the next slide, Andrew.
I don't think it likes me too much here. Let's give it another try. Oh,
okay.
So that's it, right? Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So this is obviously the same parameters, same basic chart, but this is a whole nother year's worth of data. After the trial, we decided to start throwing in the alphalase advance, or throwing the enzyme with pretty much every brew, particularly of our lager beers. And this is the exact same beer from the last one. Basically, all the rest of the parameters are exactly the same. And you can kind of tell when he shifted the slide, there is definitely a difference where things are at. And we had used the enzyme a little bit enough to know that it was, and not to spoil the surprise or anything, but that it was terribly effective. And so right off the bat, we kind of decided we were going to change our spec down from 70 ppb to 50 ppb. And so this kind of chart, again, follows an entire year of using the enzyme in every batch. And as you can see, it's all a lot lower. And it'll take a little bit of some translation here in a second to really kind of point out the kind of benefits that we got and why we've continued to use the enzyme. But you can see, I can't say that necessarily we have a whole lot less variability, but what we did get is a lot more consistent. And if you look underneath, again, the difference between those orange dots and the gray dots, the difference between its last day of fermentation, or last day of where it hit terminal and its last day of fermentation of as far as diacetyl rest goes, are super tight. Where the whole way we're within about a day, day and a half between those two. And sometimes that data point actually represents a double check, you know, that we hit terminal and we actually then waited a day to cool just to make sure there wasn't any more attenuation, because we were kind of riding on top of ourselves. And you don't want to do that either because of the kind of things, you know, he mentioned hop creep earlier. If you cool too early and in the process of cooling, there's a little bit of bonus fermentation that happens in, say, that first few hours, you could conceivably produce some diacetyl that then is not going to get reabsorbed once the temperature drops. So this is a very careful way of us doing kind of the daily testing. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to put the previous chart and this chart and see a significant difference in that overall testing. That we not only was it, and you'll see, not only was it faster, you know, by a couple days, but we're actually hitting a spec 20 ppb lower. And I think that's an important thing to state right now. For us to have gotten 50 ppb before this, before using the enzyme, I had said that usually we were in a kind of 5 to 7 day diacetyl rest post-terminal gravity. Well, if we were going to 50, then it easily would have been closer to what Andrew mentioned earlier. It would have definitely been closer to 10 to 12 days, because we could get to 50, we could get below 50, but it would take you know, additional days. And as far as our flavor threshold, our personal thoughts on the flavor threshold, 70 was, you know, basically one standard deviation below the mean, and we figured that was a very kind of safe and conservative place to be, so that it wouldn't show up for the vast majority of the population. But an even safer place to be is 50 ppb. You get closer now to almost 2 standard deviations below the mean, which means that the population that can taste that is incredibly small. It's nearly negligible. But again, these two represent each other. The following slide, Andrew, if you could advance it. So this kind of shows that data, leaving out the terminal days completely, just simply the diacetyl levels. You can see the difference between the two. All those blue dots you have on there, that's us doing our best to get our diacetyl levels down using traditional methods. And I mean, as exacting as a regional brewer of our size can be with the tools at our disposal. And then you see just a simple, the only real difference, no changes, particularly in malt, no changes in yeast, no changes in recipe. All you see is that addition of that enzyme, and then you see all the data in orange, and you see that very wide gap between the two that has made our kind of production process much smoother. So I don't really think there's too much else to share as far as the data goes. Feel free to ask questions at the end about any of these data points. Some of that variability too, because we produce so much of this beer, oftentimes, you know, we're blending it out. So the actual final diacetyl level is actually right along that midline. That trend line really represents where our actual diacetyl levels are going out the door in the finished beer. So that's I think a very helpful metric to look at. So we could advance further. We'll start talking about, you know, things that we see as far as it being a benefit.
Good. Oh, yes, there you go.
All right. So, and I think the kind of one of the fun things about this is, you know, I wouldn't say we'd be skeptical of using it so much as just, you always kind of wonder about adding, you know, any kind of additional costs into your product. And so we did a simple trial where our smaller brewery We did two 20-barrel batches side by side, everything the same yeast, same pitch, same. As well controlled as it could be, and the only difference between the two was adding even on the low level. I believe it was only 0.5 grams per hectoliter that we added it during the trial. And it was very clear. It saw absolutely no difference in the actual fermentation profile, except for one simply cleared diacetyl 2 days earlier than the other. So this very simple trial showed us proof of concept. And essentially, we've seen that same consistent performance from this enzyme ever since that initial trial. We have originally added it to all lager fermentation, and as I mentioned before, and all that data are 12 month snapshots of one particular lager brand. At this point, we actually add it to every fermentation we have because we've seen benefits to non-lager products as well. So a couple things just to kind of sum up what it's doing beyond just shortening that. It's also more consistent. If you actually break down the variability, we did actually get less variability in our final diacetyl levels using the enzyme. So even though there's a little bit of chaos still in the system, you do get a terribly consistent pattern using it. And what that means on a couple levels is not just for the beer, but also for a guy like me who's running the lab and doing a lot of the testing, or whatever technician I might have in here doing the testing. We actually do less testing. You know, we used to have this wider range of days we had to test. You know, maybe we were testing a beer over the course of 4 or 5 days, you know, to get its diacetyl level before cooling. And now it's fairly rare for us to have to test a beer more than 2 or 3 days. So just from a testing standpoint and a time and a resource to test for diacetyl, you know, we've probably reduced that, you know, 40% by using this. So it goes beyond just the beer quality, but also the time where that quality time in the lab could be used for other things. In particular, like I said, it's so consistent, we were able to actually cut our VDK spec across the board for all of our beers down to 50. Now, this is an interesting concept because as much as diacetyl is known to be, you know, an off flavor or a defect, there is actually something to below the flavor threshold. There is actually a mouthfeel aspect that is oftentimes a desired effect of diacetyl. So you don't actually want to necessarily go ridiculously low, especially in a whole malt beer. But you do want to have it at that point where nobody tastes as a defect. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. But for us, we thought it was the smart move to go ahead and ride with it and bring our spec down to 50, seeing as though it didn't massively interfere with our production schedule. And ultimately to us was a higher quality product. And as I said, that's very important to understand, because not only is this saving time for us to get down to 70, but it's also getting us past it to 50 in that same amount of time. So it's not just the time it takes, it saves us getting to 70, it saves us that while getting down to 50. So it's kind of that double benefit that's not the easiest thing to fully qualify that number of days, but you know, this 2 or 3 days extra plus another 2 or 3 days. So for us, we're looking at somewhere between a 5-7 day reduction in tank time utilizing the enzyme. Okay, so I think that covers those first two. Let's move to the next one. And I said, I kind of hit on that already. The consistent process times. This has really helped our production manager and our brewers. They're much less, I get far less emails and texts and whatever else being like, did this beer pass? Did this beer pass? Did this beer pass? I used to get that, you know, kind of day in, day out, you know, kind of hoping that this particular one was finally going to pass diacetyl that day and they could go ahead and cool it because we needed to brew more and, you know, orders were piling up. In this case, I very rarely get a text anymore. I mean, they just know that our loggers are going to clear on like day 8. They just know it. And it's when one doesn't that they're like, oh, what happened? And we kind of get the opposite, where instead of them kind of badgering me about that, it's like when we have one going, everyone thinks something terrible went wrong. It's like, hey, it cooled on day 9 or 10 instead of 8. We'll be all right. But this is important because if you go down to the again back to production management, if you add up, we've got 11 120 barrel unit tanks. If you throw that in the year, it's about 4,000 quote unquote tank days a year. And by reducing and for us, we're a little out of the ordinary for American craft brewers in that we produce vast majority of our beer are lager beers. We see this reduction in kind of those dead tank days where you're just kind of keeping a beer cold just to keep it cold, only for or keeping it cool at diacetyl rest temperature for nothing else but to get the diacetyl reduced. By cutting out about 2 to 5 days, depending on how you want to look at it, for us in those tank days, with the exact same number of tanks, we're able to produce anywhere between 11 to 33% more beer with the exact same hardware, the exact same amount of stainless steel. And this was real important because those other 3 tanks we were going to order, that's $350,000 of capital expense going out the door when we essentially didn't need it. So by using the enzyme, we actually staved off for a couple of years having to get these additional tanks because there was a better way to maximize our production without sacrificing beer quality. And I think before I leave this, because this is the last actual slide, but I do want to revisit since Andrew kind of added in the aspects of dry hopping. For us, and again, this is more of just an aside, this is how we do things without giving a whole lot of whatever, I guess, maybe proprietary process type stuff together. We did see a certain amount of hop creep from our dry hops, and we would get that. I always test the beers before the dry hop to get a baseline. So now we've completely lost my lager data, and this is ale data that's not in this presentation. But we would see that, and I would always make sure to get a baseline of diacetyl before they would dry hop, and then test it after the dry hop, usually after the day after. And we always would see a little boost after dry hopping, even if you only saw a 0.1 decrease in your apparent extract, there would always be a little bump, maybe 10, maybe 15 ppb, which could very much make the difference in the finished product if you're not paying attention. And then predictably, it would reduce down another day. But every now and then, particularly some of the ale strains we were using at the time, sometimes after the dry hop bump in diacetyl, the yeast would very much struggle to get rid of and to reduce the remaining diacetyl. And so it was actually kind of interesting. We were having a harder time with a couple of our dry hop beers, getting them to finally reduce. They reduced just fine before the dry hop, but they actually were very laggy after the dry hop in reducing it. So that was one of the decisions we used when deciding to add dialphylase to our dry hopped beers, was basically as a hedge our bets against that extended post dry hop reduction time, because most of the time that wasn't an issue, but we would get a batch every now and then and be very frustrating because they would think, oh, dry hop it, it'll cool it in 2 days, get it cleaned up and packaged, and then all of a sudden be, no, hold on, it's spiked up in diacetyl and it's just sitting there, and we're trying to figure out ways, and like even a traditional method, we even had times where we had croissant something to try to get the diacetyl back down into spec. So there's this there's a bunch of things that we've seen it be an example of, and that's something we're still following, because our process for using it for dry hop beers has only been in this last year. So I don't really have that data put together, but I do know just from a simple observation that we find it terribly effective for preventing that kind of re-fermentation spike in diacetyl levels as far as cooling. So other than that, I think that pretty much sums up my end. And I think we probably are at that point where we're probably ready for questions.
Yes, I'll just advance it here. Everyone should get this in the presentation. So some additional resources, if you're interested to find out more about diacetyl and specifics, that will be in the presentation. And if you want to get more information, I want to thank Kurt and everyone at Urban Chestnut. They have always been very helpful, very generous with their time. And so I hope I'm not imposing upon you, Kurt, but I think if anybody reaches out to you, you'll be more than happy to help and answer some questions. I am as well. And of course, don't forget your local Gusmer sales rep is also a good first point of contact. So that's it. We just went over dry hopping. So I think I could just go ahead and stop sharing now. And we will answer some questions here, right?
All right, well, thank you so much, Andrew and Kurt, for that wonderful presentation. We do have one question in the Q&A. This is coming from Matt. Andrew mentioned enzyme addition cold side pre-yeast. How long does enzyme need to be added before yeast, followed by, is there a reaction time?
Cold side pre-yeast. Okay, so you're adding the enzyme to your cold wort before you add your yeast. And so you can imagine the yeast is getting added as soon as possible into the fermenter as you're filling it with cold wort. So just ahead of that, just ahead of your yeast pitch, you would want to add the enzyme.
And as far as our end of it, we haven't seen any sort of, the only complicating factor in adding it from a practical standpoint is just minding your tank, and just kind of understanding that however you add it, you want to make sure that it gets into the liquid in the tank as soon as possible. So whether if you have the ability to direct inject it into the cold side, which is not particularly common, chances are you're thrown into the manway or something like that. You just have to watch it as cold side. Obviously, you have to have micro considerations, things like that. But ultimately, we've found the best benefit is making sure that it gets direct in the liquid and doesn't necessarily kind of run down the cone of the tank or whatever when you throw it in. You definitely want it to get into solution as simple, as quick as possible. Once you do, it pretty much do exactly what you need it to do.
Yes, I'd like to add to that, right? Pouring it onto just pouring it into the tank. Number one, yes, micro considerations. If you're leaning into a tank or if you're reaching in with a bucket, you have the potential to contaminate the beer, introduce some bacteria. And you do want it mixed into some solution. So you don't want to pour it onto the side of the tank. It won't mix as well. So with some wort in the tank before you add your yeast. If you do have some kind of way to add it inline into the wort stream as that's going into the tank, that would be probably the best option.
Thank you. We'll jump to the second question here. Has there been any noticeable effect on yeast health? Specifically, are you able to successfully harvest and pitch yeast from fermentations using the ALDC?
As far as our brewery goes, our primary repitched yeast is our house lager strain, and we have seen absolutely nothing negative from using it. There's no real change in fermentation performance or viability. We run a real high viability. Usually when we're repitching, we're repitching it, from the cone, even at 96% viability. And we haven't seen any sort of deleterious or negative effects of using the enzyme. The yeast just keeps getting, like I said, and it gets repitched multiple times. It's exposed to that enzyme, like I said, in every single lager brew. So we haven't had a point in the last couple of years that we have not had our yeast exposed to this enzyme and doing its job. So from our perspective, we've never seen anything that would be considered negative. I would have a hard time saying it's benefited anything because we've made some, just good, proper process improvements on our yeast health, but that stuff would have happened anyway.
And we have not had any negative feedback from customers globally, and we're seeing increased use of this enzyme from all brewers. So I think it's safe to say no negative effect on yeast pitching.
Thank you. We have another question for Kurt here. Can you describe the desirable mouthfeel that diacetyl gives when under threshold levels?
For many people, and this is something that's real important to our brewmaster, he picks up on it really, really well, but it's a certain roundness. It's not oily or slick like you'd think. It's somewhere in that kind of 50 to 70 to maybe 80 range. It just simply gives a little bit more of a full mouth feel without adding flavor. So you get almost a little bit of body from it. And if you can really tell, because we have had some beers, like in our own internal taste panels, we've done some where, we did let the diacetyl get ridiculously low, down to 15, 20 ppb. And, you do kind of pick up on the difference at that point. So that's why I said there's not to use a pun, but there is a butter zone right in that range where you're far enough below the flavor threshold that you don't worry about it being a defect. At the same time, its presence there, like it's almost like if you completely get rid of it, people might notice that something's missing, but they won't be able to put their finger on it. It might be a little thinner. But if you get right in that kind of zone where you can't taste it, but whether you realize it or not, you might be feeling it. It actually kind of adds that positive benefit. So we kind of run with that idea, and we've gotten, again, external and internal feedback on that topic. And there are papers out there that talk about the mouthfeel of vinyl diketones, how they impact finished beers. So I hope that answers it.
Great. Thank you, Kurt. And then we have another question. Is there a correlation on VDK ppb versus enzyme dosage? What is the max dosage versus effectiveness?
I guess that depends on whether you want, I mean, IFF's done a ridiculous amount of research to give you the exact dosage rates. What I can tell you from using it practically for a couple of years is that it is a little bit, like we have a slightly different amount that we add to whatever the beer is we're putting it into. We go way on the low end for any of our higher temperature fermentations. We go slightly above the medium dosage when we have, because we do quite a few adjunct lagers as well. We do one rice lager and a corn lager. Those do take a little bit longer to reduce. By bumping up the enzyme 10%, 20%, you pretty much negate the difference. And so we see it being a very recipe dependent. You do have to watch it. I mean, there is a cost associated with the enzyme. So there is a detriment to over adding, because you will end up passing diacetyl before final gravity. And we actually found that out when a brewer accidentally added too much to a brew one time, and it cleared diacetyl, and it was only about 75% of the way through fermentation. And the end beer actually was almost at 0 in it. And so, you don't want to over add it, because you'll kind of ruin you're basically throwing enzyme away at that point. So if you under, you'll get underperformance. If you over, you'll get overperformance. And it's about finding kind of a joy zone for you in that addition rate. But we found that the joy zone is in the rates that IFF lists for this. So as long as you stay within those parameters and then iterate that, you'll find the right amount for your beer, for your process, for your tanks, for your yeast. And it might be a style by style thing depending on what you add it to.
Yeah, I would just add, so the general range, 0.5 to 1.0 grams per hectoliter. As Kurt said, you can add more than that, but you would add too much and you wouldn't really get a benefit. So you're overdosing and wasting enzyme. You're not being efficient. Probably, I think most brewers are still waiting a day or two after cooling is on before they say fermentation is complete and they go to the next step in the process. There are other things happening too. So not only are you looking at diacetyl reduction, but you might still be harvesting yeast. So you want yeast flocculation. There could be other flavors that still need to be corrected or adjusted. Maybe something like acetaldehyde, which is also requires yeast. And then you also have a haze development, right? You still need cold temperatures to bring the protein polyphenol combination out of solution so that either you can centrifuge and remove it or filter it. So I think in the most part, it's that 0.5 gram to 1 gram per hectoliter. Dosing less would still work, but it takes you much longer time. So you're not seeing any benefit of using the enzyme if you're dosing too little and you're still waiting a long time for diacetyl to come down. And it is recipe dependent, recipe, fermentation profile, your tank geometry as well. All those play into what would be for you, your brand and your brewery, the optimum dose.
Great, thank you. We currently don't have any open questions right now. We still have a few minutes left, so please, if there are any questions, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. We'll go ahead and address those. I do have a question myself for Kurt. You have been using this enzyme for years now. You're kind of like the expert level user of this. Do you have any tips or guidance to share with others out there that may not be familiar with enzymes or just maybe a little bit uncomfortable with using them?
I think maybe I'll cite a couple of things. One, I think after giving this similar presentation at the Brewer Summit, I was approached by quite a few brewers, and I'll just frame it as doing smaller than our brewery, rather than the tens of thousands of barrels, more in the hundreds or low thousands of barrels. And quite a few of them had dabbled in some enzyme things. And one of the things they ran into was, just simply like actually kind of wondering what people might think, wondering about their brand, wondering about all sorts of things. And, one comment would be is that we have some award-winning lagers here, and we haven't won less awards or garnered less people. Like, we're pretty free with our processes. Like right now, we're literally broadcasting it over the internet that, yeah, we use this enzyme to help us out with that, because we believe in brewing being an art and a science. You should be using both sides to produce the highest quality product. So I think it's kind of like really taking a deep dive at your process and what you want to accomplish. There are certain brewers out there where this product is not for them, depending on their process. But if you're somebody who, where we've talked to some very small brewers around here that have wanted to trial it just to see it in case they needed it, to kind of get more familiar with. And I think that's kind of the place to start, is try it out and see. It's your product. You make your decisions what's best for your stream, for your production. But like I said, for us, it was a real sin, because we have the ability to test, for microstability. We have the ability to autoclave things. We have the ability to know that we can add something on the cold side very safely. So we went into using it with a lot of confidence. I think that by using it, it's another benefit of adding something like this is that you kind of get everybody on the same page. They should be already, but it's a kind of a real stress to, you have to do this, or you have to run that risk of say contamination or something like that. So it's a really good kind of process thing, because we go into it using it very, very confidently. And I think that some of people might be hesitant is that they know that there's probably parts of their process that also need improvement on top of it. There's something to be said for all of this, is that not to be scared of it. It does exactly what they say it's going to do. And if that works, or if you see those potential benefits as being of benefit to your brewery, I highly recommend, giving it a shot and see what you think, see what it does. And then if there's benefit, to continue using it. Like, so for us, it's a no-brainer. But for others, I think you have to make that decision for yourself, but not to be scared of it. It really just saves you time.
Thank you, Kurt. So this brings us to almost the top of the hour. So I would like to thank both Andrew and Kurt for their time and for their information sharing on this webinar. For those of you out there that may have questions later on, you will get access to this video by email, and you'll have access to Kurt and Andrew's email as well. So if you've got any questions later on, feel free to reach out directly to them, or please reach out to Gusmer as well. We can definitely put you in contact with one of our technical reps to help you answer any questions you may have on ALDC. Thank you again.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, if I can, Muli, if there are any
Sure.
brewers out there interested, we're certainly interested to talk to you. And if the conditions are right, we're more than happy to send you a sample to give it a try. I think the proof is in the pudding. So if you try it, you'll have much better appreciation for what it does and what it can do for your brewery.
True, very true. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
For more information, go to gusmerenterprises.com. Click on Contact Your Rep on the top menu and then choose your state. The technical sales representative in your region will then be selected. Gusmer Enterprises, service with knowledge since 1924.